Hello, YouTube. Luigi here. Tonight I'm going to tell you a joke. It's my favorite joke. Now it's long, and if you're young, you may not even have any idea who the players are. But that's not your fault, being young. It's unfortunate, but it's not your fault. Okay, so George Herbert Walker Bush, former CIA director, the one who went to Yale on his own merits, not like some other George W. we know, became president of the United States. President George H.W. Bush is going to Moscow for a visit with Boris Yeltsin. Now, you have to remember, this is right after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Gorbachev has handed the torch over to Boris Yeltsin, who was the first duly elected president in an election in this new country, Russia, new country, right? Highly capitalistic, having a booming economy, doing really well, elections and everything. So George gets over there and he sits down in Boris's office and he says, "Boris, how did you do this? The whole world is just a whirl. How did you do this so quickly? You turned this communist country around into a thriving capitalistic power. Everybody wants to know, how did you do this?" And Boris says, "It's really easy. I just assemble good people on my team." And George says, "It can't possibly be that easy." And Boris says, "Yeah, it is. I just get really good people to be on my team." And George says, "Well, how do you know if they're good enough to be on your team?" And Boris says, "I ask them one question. And if they can answer that question, they're good enough to be on my team." And George says, I still don't get it." So at that point, Boris Yeltsin presses his intercom button and has his secretary send in Eduard Shevardnadze. So now Shevardnadze's in the room with George Bush and Boris Yeltsin. So Boris says to Eduard, he goes, "Eduard, who's your father's son who's not your brother?" And Eduard thinks a little bit. "Father's son, not my brother." He says, why, that would be me." And Boris says, "Very good. You can leave now." So the minute Eduard Shevardnadze's out of the room, George Bush says, "That's it? That's all there is to it?" And Boris says, "Yeah, that's it. If they can answer that one question, they're good enough to be on my team." And George goes, "This is great. I'm going to try this when I get back to Washington." So George Bush is now back in Washington. He's in the Oval Office, and the door's open, and he sees Dan Quayle walking around in the corridor. Vice President Dan Quayle. And he says, Dan, come in here. So Dan walks in, and George says to Dan, he asks him, "Dan, who's your father's son who's not your brother?" And Dan goes, "Father's son, not my brother." And he's really thinking about this, and he's taking a long time. And before you know it, the red phone rings, the hotline rings from Russia. And George says, you wait outside in the hall and think about this. I got to take this call. So Dan Quayle's out in the hall, really breaking his brain on this riddle. And he sees then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney walk by. And Dan goes, Dick, you're a smart guy. Who's your father's son who's not your brother?" And Dick's thinking about this. "Father's son, not my brother." He says, why, that would be me." And Dan goes, "I got it. Thank you." So you think you know the answer here. So George gets off the phone and he calls Dan back and he says, "You've had plenty of time to think about this, Dan. Okay, who's your father's son who's not your brother?" And Dan Quayle says, of course, "Dick Cheney." And George says, "No, you idiot. It's Eduard Shevardnadze." It's a good joke. It's a good joke because you don't see it coming and you think you know the answer before you get there. Oh, God. More humor, people. Look what's going on in the world. Good Lord. How about some humor? We'll humor our way to world peace, okay? Why not? Nothing else has worked. Why not? All right, everybody. God bless you. I love you all. Bye-bye.